today. I put on a little, the comments in the when I originally posted that we're doing the Facebook Live. We didn't really have a specific topic, and we were going to get have some questions come in, and somebody had asked me this a while ago. So because we've done the knee and the thorax and the foot and neural tension, and I thought that this question was really interesting, and it was, what are some typical movement patterns that we assess? And I was like, that was an interesting question, because everybody is talking about functional movement and looking at, different patterns. And there are certain patterns that I look at depending on the patient population. So I'll just start off, Susan, and then you can, she'll take it from there.
Sounds good.
So for example, no matter what type of issue the patient's coming in with, for example, as a runner, right? I always look at thoracic rotation in a runner. I don't care if they have foot pain, because it's important, because you run. And a lot of people, really run sort of very efficiently for them, where they don't have a lot of rotation, and that works for them. But nonetheless, I still look at rotation in the seated trunk rotation, because I've seen in the past that I've had a lot of patients, for example, who've had foot pain and who've had their foot treated, but they really weren't 100%. They still had some issues running, and it literally came down to their lack of or asymmetrical rotation to one side, and they were offloading a painful foot. So for me, it's a typical, that pattern is, thoracic rotation in sitting. I guess you could look at it in standing, but I don't, to be honest. I mean, I do sometimes, but that's definitely in runners. I will also look at, in running, a one-legged standing, because running is one-legged, and that is hard sometimes to assess, because you have to sort of I marry my body to their body, so I'm kind of over on whatever side they're standing on, and I'm looking, and that's a skill set that you just learn with practice. If I don't see anything in a one-legged standing, I'll maybe do a teeny one-legged squat, or I'll just have them just take a step forward, do a step forward and then take a step backwards. And I'll watch them run, but I don't watch them run in the first session unless if they brought their shoes and it's been prepped. But those are typical, sort of the one-legged standing and the thoracic rotation. Those are the ones I definitely look at. And then if I'm not finding anything else, I'll maybe do a walking lunge. Do you want to add anything in Susan for that? Or?
So yeah, no, backing up to the rotation is important for the following reasons. Number one, you have to have rotation, counter rotation through the kinetic chain, particularly the trunk with running, because the arm motion comes from and feeds into trunk rotation for a reason. And one of those reasons is that is the way that you can power the pectoralis major to lift the rib cage, because with running you have to hyperventilate. That you have to ventilate more. This is not quiet walking or doing that kind of stuff. Running is effort, and it needs to have the oxygen effort to go with it. And so the intercostals can only do so much, the diaphragm can only do so much, and the pectoralis minor is sitting right on the top of the rib cage. And so you get mechanical loading, you get, as the arm goes back, you get the stretch, right? Like the load, and then as it comes forward you get the explode while the other one is loading. And so you get that nice pull on the rib cage, and it's one side at a time, and that's accomplished by rotation.
Yep.
So who's to say does rotation, is it set up in the spine or is it set up in the arms? Doesn't really matter to me. It has to occur. And if you have a spine that's not rotating well for whatever thousands of reasons that could be, that could really interfere with their ability to run well, or maybe even their wind, like their endurance with running and things like that. It could also maybe overload, the lower chain. And they could probably get by with that for years until one day that one pattern that they have is symptomatic. Now they've got to change and their system doesn't know how. So, taking them into that and getting, that going, I think is really important to look at. So I love that, first of all, because anybody who knows me knows rotation is king. We were having a discussion about this in the Birth Healing Summit on their Facebook Live earlier today. And I was just going back to it saying, we have to rotate. We just have to.
Yeah.
It's a transverse plane. You know, the transverse plane motion is one of the cardinal planes of motion, and it's
Yeah.
the first one that's lost. And
Yeah.
although, you know, running is a sagittal plane event, there's rotation inherent within it. And
Mm-hmm.
so if we lose the rotation, you know, then all we're getting is sagittal plane motion. And the system's not set up for that. It's set up for both.
No.
You know, we want to go ahead. Yeah, we want to move ahead, but we also want to have the rotation going, because that's how we get that leg reaching out longer. You know, that's how we get the foot kind of getting in position to load and explode as we move over it, which brings me to the
Mm-hmm.
second part, is about the single leg stance you were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
How do they cope with load transfer? You know, exactly,
Mm.
because in
Yeah.
the way you were talking about mirroring them and what's actually happening, are they like really sliding around in that load transfer? Are they able to really like contain it and explode off of it? I would even say that I find a lot of value in looking at single leg stance and like really kind of getting an idea of that, but looking at it a little dynamically too. You know,
Mm-hmm.
can they squat a bit? You know, they don't have to do a full pistol squat to run. Sorry,
Ah.
but they don't. You know, it's great if
Mm-hmm.
they do. I'm impressed with people who can, you know, but because I can't. I can do it
Me neither.
assisted, but I can't do it by myself. You know, but the idea is that they need, I like to look at taking that single leg stance into like, you know, a hopping on one
Oh.
leg, you know,
Mm-hmm.
so you can think about, you know, skipping a way to kind of begin to, you know, if somebody can't run
I
full
like
out,
skipping.
can they start to do some assisted skipping? Can they start to do some unweighted skipping, holding on to, you know, a heavy band, and, you know, just kind of like just doing some up and down bouncing and just kind of getting that whole thing back in,
Mm-hmm.
can be quite helpful too. So I love both of those together, because you have to have both of those.
Yeah, if you think about it, when you skip, you're using your arms. You need momentum. How are
Mm-hmm.
you going to get momentum when you run if you're like this? And there are a lot of people who run like this, but they're, I believe, over recruiting something lower down. Or it also, I mean, you're the breath expert, but you can't breathe efficiently when you have an, you know, when you're running with a very rigid torso, correct?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just
Right.
not.
Or they may just be, you know, there's a lot of people out there that run for days and days and days and days without a lot of rotation. But again, down the road, if they become symptomatic, it's something we have to look at, because I don't see people who run that aren't symptomatic. I mean, I don't sit there and look at the park and go, hey, that person, throw a card at them because they're going to need
Mhm.
me. Because I
Right,
don't really know that. You know,
right,
nobody knows what's, you know, maybe they have an event and they hurt their knee, and then now that particular style they have no longer works for them
right,
because they're symptomatic from some other thing that's happened. Like, I used to run all the time, and then I fell down the stairs and hurt my knee, and I haven't been able to run since.
right.
And it's
Yeah.
like, maybe it's because they're trying to run in the same pattern they were doing before that they can't compensate with anymore. And, you know, we really want them to be able to do that
Yeah.
and to get in there with that.
Yeah.
So uh, you know, just thinking about those along the lines in that kind of way can be kind of fun,
Yeah.
and really looking at that. So and I find, going back to also another thing that you talk about when movement patterns that you look at a lot are at the foot. And
Mm.
this is probably a good time to just kind of repeat that a little bit. Like, what do you look at the foot when we're thinking about running? Because now we've kind of moved this from movement patterns to
Yeah.
running. What movement patterns do we look at with running?
Right.
Talk
Yeah.
a little bit about the foot stuff that you do, because you do some cool things when you're
Yeah.
looking at
So,
that.
I mean, I'll just give a quick example beforehand. So, I did have a patient some years ago. He had a peroneus brevis tendinopathy, and this was a while ago. And he, you know, people were working on his foot, and he wasn't getting better. And I watched him run, and I'm looking at him. I was videoing him, and his arm, like his left was his left foot, and his left rotation, thoracic rotation, was hyper, like more than normal. He was throwing his weight onto the outside border of his left foot, and he had very minimal right rotation. Why? I don't know. He changed jobs recently. Maybe it was the ergonomics changed. So ultimately, with him, I ended up working on restoring right rotation and making him aware of the fact that he, you don't have to sit there and think, are my elbows, symmetrical when I run, but you want to train a movement pattern so that it becomes ingrained in your brain. So I absolutely, the key with him with that foot pain was that he did need to restore some thoracic rotation. With the foot, so for a runner, I mean, you obviously need to look at a heel raise. I mean, you absolutely need
Mm-hmm.
to see how they heel raise and how they squat. So when they squat, you need to look at that fanning of the foot. And when they go into a heel raise, you absolutely need to see what it looks like. So from a step forward perspective, if you take a step forward onto that left foot and you weight transfer, ultimately you're going to need that fan at some point in that left foot, and then you're going to need that push off on that back foot. I will look at that multiple times in a patient who's a runner or who has foot pain or doesn't have foot pain. If I'm not finding anything else, I will look at that step forward. I will also look at lateral movement. And it's interesting, Susan, I know we all know that inversion and eversion exist in the foot, right? But we tend to look a lot at, can they do a heel raise? Can they do a squat, which is important. However, I am doing this more and more now. Can they do a lateral lunge? How do they load their feet laterally? Let's say you're standing and you do a lateral lunge to the right. Can you invert that left foot and sort of evert that left foot and invert that right foot? Can you have rotation in your feet? So it's a rotary joint like the thorax. So I'm including now much more, heel raise squat, but also lateral lunge. And it doesn't have to be a big lunge. It's, you can just have them do a weight shift. But I think you should test inversion and eversion, and not in the way that we sit there and test it with our hands. I think we need to come up with some good functional movements that can test that, right? I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. And it's going to go back to that mechanical loading piece again too, as well as that neurological kind of connection. The mechanical piece is that, the rotary piece of the foot. I think in running more than ever, we need to be sure that because some feet are a little bit more rigid, some feet are not as rigid. That doesn't really matter to me as much, but being able to move through the range of motion that they do have is important. So they need to rotate into that pronated or inverted type of posture, whichever definition you're going to use, because that's how they get the eccentric loading for the exploding. And they can't get that otherwise if they don't allow that to happen. So if they're running on the outside borders of their feet, the shock attenuation is going to change.
Yes,
definitely. And again, how long can they cope with that? Maybe their whole life, maybe not. But then something happens and all of a sudden they can't cope with the lack of shock attenuation. Maybe they have a baby and all of a sudden that lack of shock attenuation becomes, more prevalent, and they start leaking or something because the shock, they're not able to mitigate the shock as well. Or like you talk about, they, maybe they've lost thoracic rotation, and sometimes they can regain that by bringing that back in. But looking at the two ends together, I think is really important. That's where I was going to get into the neurological part, is that what's driving what, is the spring in our step coming from the ability to a little hyper respirate a bit and really get into the run? Or are we trying to be too relaxed in our run that we're just kind of not really revving the engine up to do it? And that it just maybe means on what kind of running are we doing? Are we looking at a marathon versus a short-term runner, right. A runner that maybe isn't running, but 1 or 2Ks or 5Ks versus, because there's strategies for endurance conservation and marathon running that doesn't occur in sprint running.
Yep.
So we're two ends of the spectrum, and most of our people are somewhere in between. So in a marathon runner, you definitely, I think, in my humble opinion, I think you need good rotation and you need good mobility in the joints for the ability to kind of have the shock attenuation because of the long endurance that they have with the activity. Whereas sprinters can get away with a little bit less shock attenuation and a lot more power, So we're looking at two ends of the spectrum here and kind of trying to figure it out and what's going to work the best. And then, of course, then there's all the body types in between and who's trying to do what. But
And I often ask the patients, and going back to the original question, the movement patterns, if let's say they're a runner, where is it with your left leg forward or left leg backward? And I really have them focus. Runners are focused on running. I mean, it's like golfers. They get it. Like they are so in tune with their running. And sometimes it doesn't manifest as pain. It may manifest as decreased performance. Their times go down. They feel tired. They're fatigued. They're breathing more. Their energy expended. It doesn't have to be pain. And a lot of times it is, but the higher you get in the sport, you're going to have other performance issues, efficiency issues that need to get addressed, and that may not be at the forefront of their brain. So, I often ask, especially with runners, that particular question with, the loading, and I mean, ultimately with the foot, with a runner, you're looking at the foot. I mean, it's in the diagnostics. You have to do that, whether it's the driver or not. You have to. They're runners. I mean, you have to look at the foot, and I've definitely incorporated much more side to side mobility in the evaluation, just because I think that often gets missed, initially. And because lateral, like lunges, side lunges, lateral lunges are really hard for the feet in general, that if there's some sort of deficiency or dysfunction there, it's nice to know up front, because especially with the runner, if you're designing an exercise program and they're doing lateral movement and you haven't assessed that at the beginning, that could actually make them worse. So you almost need to take them down a little bit, a notch, because a lot of people just want to go run and they don't necessarily want to do the building blocks to running. And I don't think that that's smart, because people will go back too soon and they'll injure themselves. So,
well, people are going to go back to the movement pattern of choice, which is the one that's more ingrained.
yeah.
And if they're symptomatic with that ingrained pattern, it's not that that pattern's a bad pattern. It's just that it's become symptomatic for them.
Yeah.
So, looking at those kinds of things can be really inherent in helping them change. And I like the idea of the side lunges and side swipes and, even braided walking and, moving and hopping back and forth that way, mainly because it takes them out of pattern and it helps the feet return to being the rudders, of the motion again, because it challenges the foot in a different way. And so that begins to challenge up the kinetic chain in a different way. And it's not that they're going to be running sideways, but it does help them build variance in their ingrained patterns, so that perhaps they will become less symptomatic with their pattern instead of more symptomatic, because again, we're not seeing them unless they're symptomatic.
Yeah, totally. And even I have them also just run backwards, just backpedal. Basketball players do it all the time.
Yep.
They have to run backwards. Runners, like marathon runners, don't need to run backwards, don't need to run sideways, but you need to train that. And that's a movement pattern. Like if it's a basketball player, you're looking at them running backwards. You have to. And that's that, for example, is hard to assess. You can look at it. You can certainly look at it and then maybe find your driver or find your cause in another movement pattern, maybe like a one-legged stance, maybe like a little one-legged squat, and see if when you treat that backwards walking looks better, or that backwards running looks better. So those are the ones that I pretty much look at for running. I mean, there's a lot, but the rotation's a big one, I think. So the other question was, for example, with sitting. So this person asked,
Yeah, hang on just a second. Just for everybody watching, we're talking about movement patterns. And we kind of just launched into running and what movement patterns we look at with running. So if you all have any questions, shout out to Annie and Lindsay for writing in. Hello, ladies. And if you have any questions, or feel free to type them in. But go ahead, Erica. Okay, looking at sitting.
Yes. So looking at, I don't see the on my phone. Looking at sitting. So, obviously you'd say they have come in low back pain with sitting. I mean, I'll look at sitting, obviously. How do you get to a seated posture? You squat. You have to look at them squat. I look at a forward bend. That's your fave. I look at them bending forward. I look at them slumping. I look at them sitting. Those are the three obvious ones that I look at. If someone, for example, has neck pain with sitting, I actually will look at head rotation, but the basic ones for me would be like getting to a seated position. Like I'll put the chair, and most people don't know how to squat properly. I literally have to put a chair behind them and say, can you show me how you're going to sit in this chair, but don't actually sit. Then I take it out, and then I just have them do some squats. And I'll have them do a little bit of, some slumps in sitting to see. I don't want to flare anybody up. If it's an acute disc or something, I generally won't, obviously for obvious reasons, but I don't tend to see those acute type patients. And then I'll look at them, in sitting, while have their feet propped up. And that's sort of the three go-tos that I see, no matter what symptom they're presenting with.
Mm-hmm.
Any things you want to add?
Yeah, the squatting is like the hip hinge. I need to be sure that they have the movement pattern in there to hip hinge, because so many people that I sit that go from sit to stand tend to lean backwards and try to use a lot of quad and anterior chain strategy to get up out of a chair.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why they're leaking so much, from my perspective in pelvic health. And if I can get them to hip hinge and to get them in a different position, oftentimes they likely can control their leaking a whole lot better. They're just in a different pattern that's not as biomechanically tough to do, but they've lost, for whatever reason, they've lost that ability to lean forward.
Yeah.
I have no idea why. I just know that that's what I see. And then when I see people go into a squat, I often see them go into like a tucked under type of squat.
Yep.
Relying on so much quad activity than, doing a hip hinge where they can really actually get a little bit deeper. But somewhere along the lines, they've just kind of, that strategy's there. They just quit using it, because again, we default to the strategy that's the most ingrained that we do all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And, so I think those things are really good things to look at.
Yeah.
I also look at in sitting, I look at their ability to change postures.
Yep. Move in and
We've
out
talked
of
about
posture.
this before.
Yeah.
I don't want somebody slumped all day. I don't want somebody sitting ramrod straight all day. I'd like to see them move back and forth in between.
Yes.
So that they have that ability to be much more of a dynamic sitter rather than a passive, stuck in a chair sitter.
Mm-hmm.
And, being able to get up and down from the chair with ease is going to be more motivational for people to move out of the seated posture than it is if they have a hard time getting up. They're probably not going to get up as often. And I know I see this so much, and I just think it's so antithetical. If they get up more, it wouldn't be so hard. But when you're in it and you can't do it, it becomes so non-motivating to do.
Yeah.
So, these behaviors perpetuate, each other, and just trying to figure out ways that's motivational for people to get up and move. Like, why do you want, not just the why do you want to move, but what would make you get out of the chair?
It's interesting. People say I can't go from sit to stand, and half the time they're hip hinging. They're bending over, and then they're going into end range extension and standing. I'm like, that's really not like the most efficient way to stand. You can get up to stand that way, but ultimately you may want to try a different pattern, and that's very common. So I will look at the return from the squat. But oftentimes I don't see that. I literally have to put them in a chair and show me how you get up. And they're either doing this or they're doing that, or
which is what I see more of, is the backwards one. Yes. So Lindsay's asking, do you find that in sit to stand prostatectomy patients, with prostatectomy patients, we should assess hip hinging? My answer, Lindsay, is absolutely. I find that people post prostatectomy have an overprotective quality to the whole pelvis area, and rightly so. I'm sure the brain has completely freaked out about everything that's happened, and now they're kind of in that post deal. I find that you can get more variance and the ability of the pelvic floor to recruit from a longer to a shorter position by taking them down into a hip hinge. And I definitely look at that. I look at their hip range of motion, their back range of motion, and the ability for the pelvis and the hips to move opposite of each other. And, in the back, so that if they flex their hip, their back doesn't automatically go into flexion too, that they're able to, kind of come into more of a little extension as they drop into that squat, and work on those kinds of things, because then you're looking at that pelvic floor lengthening as they go into that deeper hip hinge. And then as they go to stand up, that pelvic floor is going to be in a better position to recruit. and it's getting at, we were talking about this with running, it's getting that mechanical load, that eccentric, that lengthening to like begin to pull up in the standing up part too. So the glutes are working from eccentric to concentric with that hip hinge that you were talking about, Erica, and
Yep.
doing that exercise, like how
Yep.
far down do they need to go to the chair and how can we work that?
Yep.
You know, so you're working on that mechanical loading, mechanoreceptors, you know, that kind of thing going for recruiting. So glutes are going, pelvic floor is going, you know, hips are going, hip rotators are going, you know, lengthening into the hip hinge, and then maybe, you know, kind of changing as they come into, you know, into extension or standing and loading.
Do you often have
I
them
think that's like
change?
super important.
Yeah. Do you often have them change, just hold for a second for the leaking. Do you often have people change their weight bearing on their heels when they stand up if they leak when they stand up? Let's say they're sitting and then they leak when they stand.
So
Do
it depends
you,
on when the leaking's occurring. If it's occurring during the activity, like, is it occurring as they lean forward to stand up? Is it
yes.
occurring while they're standing up?
Okay.
Is it occurring once they get into standing?
And those are all different
Yeah,
cues.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So, but I tend to try to get people more on their whole foot. You know, get your
Yes.
feet underneath you and get up on your feet, because your feet
Yeah.
are, that's their connection down into the earth.
Yes.
And then, you know, then we have to kind of look at how long. So if they're leaking as they lean forward, they
Yep.
are likely having they've been sitting too long.
Yep.
And, you know, they're, as soon as they've been forward, that's pressure on the bladder, and
Yeah, of
their, you know,
course. Right.
their system can't handle that.
Yep.
So that's another issue. How do we strengthen that system in that lengthened position to accommodate that? Or
Yep.
were they sitting for 4 hours and now it's just too darn late,
Yep.
you know, at this stage of the game. But most of the time what I see is people, as they start to struggle, start to get up, that's when they leak. And so
Right.
getting them a lot more forward and in better position to where, you know, they can unfold easier, you know, because people just are afraid to lean that far forward. But man, all the momentum is with you when you do it.
Yeah, that's for sure. You know, it's interesting. That is interesting. I also look at with like the squatting, and we've talked about this on the podcast many times, squat with literally a very narrow base of support, heels together, squat, anything lower extremity, especially the foot. Even people that say, oh, you know, the foot doesn't matter, I'm sitting. It matters. There's a neural representation of your foot in your brain. So when you stand and it's very narrow squat, and you squat, and there's a restriction in your knee, your foot, your hip, it will come out in that narrow base. And I mean, very narrow versus like a normal hip width versus a wide base. In my experience, if you've got something lower down, you'll see it more in the narrow base versus the wider base. And that does a whole different thing for your nervous system. So I'm doing a lot more of the wide based, narrow based squat. And also I'm having people play per your answer on the weight bearing, I'm having them people stand, squat on their heel, squat, just play with their foot position. I mean, yes, if they have back pain, I may not do, the forward on the heels, back on the heels squatting, but I will definitely look at narrow versus wide base of support with squatting for sure. And often what I see in like a slump, I mean, a slump for me is not, honestly, I know we learned it in school as a neural tension test. I don't use it for neural tension. I want to see what they look like. It's a mobility test for me. Can you sink into that hip? What happens when you're driving? Someone has a problem driving. That's a movement pattern I'm going to look at. I'm going to look at them in that slump position with their arms up. So we talked about this on one of the podcasts where, if you're looking at someone who has low back pain driving and you're not looking at an arm lift, you're missing at least 50% of the picture. So
right,
yes,
because the neural tension piece, does carry through with that. So it is a mobility test, but it also tests the mobility in different positions and in different postures, which is really important because they may be able to extend their knee, but they can't raise their arms and extend their knee, then there's a problem.
Right.
Right. Or they may be able to bring their back up straight, but then they can't extend their knee. And is it because of neural tension, or is it because they don't have the range of motion?
Yes,
for
and
whatever reason, you know, so.
exactly, exactly. So if someone has a problem sitting, okay, where is it? Is it the office, or is it driving, or is it both? Generally both. But you've got that extra piece in driving with that leg extension. And what I'll also test, I'm learning this more recently, is especially in the summer, you know, when you've got the arm hanging out the window or you've got the arm on a console, I will look at, once again, thoracic rotation in the
Mm-hmm.
sitting position.
Mm-hmm.
Because more, and I don't drive that much, I don't own a car, but I guarantee you I drive how I will sit. I'm like this.
You can't see your blind spots if you can't rotate.
Exactly. Well, exactly. So
Mm.
the rotation is, in answer to the original question, the rotation is a huge piece, no matter, you know, what body part hurts, or who the
Mm-hmm.
person is sitting in front of you. Uh, it's just that integral piece in between the upper and the lower extremity, and
Right.
it links neurally, and if you want to say fascial, whatever you want to call it, there's a neural link between your foot and your head. So those are the basic ones for sitting. And the only other question this person had, and then we can finish up, is, what do you actually look at if a patient, for example, this is almost like a straightforward one. I'm just looking down at the question she wrote. What do you, if I have shoulder pain when I raise my arm? Well, you look at them raising their arm, right? I mean, that's pretty
Mm-hmm.
obvious, right? So, however, sometimes you can't see a lot or feel a lot. I will look at that, but if it's an upper extremity, talking about, and we were talking about this before we went on live, neural tension, you're looking at neural tension, right?
Right.
You're looking at median radial nerve, any upper quarter one. I do that.
Right. And you're also looking at movement patterns that may have served them for a while, but no longer serve them for whatever reason, like
Yeah.
either they've lost their ability to compensate in that pattern, and now they're symptomatic, or they've had an injury, or something has gone wrong, or they've stiffened up over time and now they're having a different movement pattern that has caused symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the other things I look at is thoracic extension, because
Oh,
oftentimes, if you slump, you can't get your arm up as
of
much, but,
course.
so we look at, some thoracic extension. I also like to look at head side bending and rotation to the same side, because
With a
generally when we're raising our arm up, we're also looking up.
Yes,
And so I
yes.
want that whole mechanism. I want to look at that and really see, is it because the eyes aren't going where they need to go, that they're over rotating the head, and that's caused, or what's happening? Are they
Mm-hmm.
having to do that to really jump in and actually do a little bit more? So to me, the eyes, the head, upper cervical spine, CT junction,
Mm-hmm.
and thoracic spine extension are going to be important. But then now, if we think about that, then we got to think about the pelvis, because the latissimus is going to be hooked from,
Yes,
the
yes,
inferior aspect of the humerus down
yeah,
onto the opposite pelvis.
yes. Thoracic lumbar
And
fascia. Yep.
so what's the pelvis doing? So if the trunk is rotating, and going with the arm, and the head and everything is going here, how are we balancing it down here
You're counter
on the
rotating,
opposite
right?
pelvis? Yeah. And then that goes into the foot.
Yeah,
So are
totally.
they lifting, are they reaching and sitting in the car
Yes.
or at work, or are they reaching and, doing it and standing, or are they on a ladder?
Mm-hmm.
Talk about
Yes.
narrow base of support when you were talking about that, which I love,
Mm-hmm.
is what about somebody who needs to bend, lift, twist, and raise their arm up on a ladder?
In standing, exact. You're
Which
not
is
having them
which
sit on
is
the plinth
all
and
of
do
our
this.
people that are doing, carpentry and
Yes.
electricians and painters and everybody.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's things that we do up on the ladder, even if we're just painting.
Yep.
How are we coping with the load transfer and with the rotation and our lack of rotation, because there's fear?
Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact,
I don't
wasn't
want
it
to
one?
fall off this ladder, so I'm going to be really super still.
Right, and right, we're going to grip, and it was one of the podcasts. It was for your patient. He
Right.
was, or she was
Mm-hmm.
painter, and it was the
Yeah,
whole
she was
standing
doing their
home
home
repairs.
improvement. Right.
That's
Yep.
right. And you looked at the standing posture because it was the base of support
Mm-hmm.
was an issue. So ultimately, with the movement patterns, yes, you're gonna do an
Had
obvious
leg
one.
pain. Yeah, but we
Yes,
looked at that whole series of movements
movements.
from the slump tests that we just talked about all the way through the whole pattern of rotation into the upper, and how she was coping with load transfer with that. And that's where we found where she was falling apart or spending hours upon hours. And I said, when you're in this position, this is a position that hurts.
Right.
And how long do you stay there? Until I'm through with whatever, how many hours of painting I do. So she was a confronter, and she was going to confront it no matter what. And, but I had, once we convinced, a way to kind of like, you got to come, she had to bargain with her to come down off the ladder and move it over and go back up. Nobody wants to do that. They just want to finish the job. But this job had been going on for 9 months. They decided to do this for their whole house. And it was like, this is not serving you anymore. And in fact, now it's keeping you from doing the thing you want to do, which is go walking with your kids. So she just had to kind of begin to understand that if I can change this position a bit, I won't have pain when I'm doing this painting, or not nearly like what I was having. And then she was able to go back and do some of those other activities again. And the change in her was dramatic.
I know. And I think
it was, I don't usually see change that fast, but with her, it was absolutely dramatic. But it had to be, I had to get her into the position. I looked at the movement patterns in isolation, and I started combining them like you were talking about. Okay, now we're doing the slump with the arms up, and then it, kind of got her up onto like, show me. I need to see what you're doing. And we were able to kind of figure that out from there. So
I'll look and see what podcast number that was and just post it in the comments, because that would be an interesting one for people to listen to. I also, I do look at rotation, because if they're limited in their trunk rotation, even with an arm lift, if they're going all the way over, then they're limited at the end, chances are they've got a lower thoracic issue. If they're just, they can't turn, then there's something, upper thorax and above in the glenohumeral, in this whole upper quarter, that needs investigation. So I do look at that if I'm not finding anything else in some of those combined motions. So I think an answer to the original question is, there are some basic movement patterns that we do look at, but to be fair, we look at them in the context of what the patient's coming in with, in the sense that, is it standing on a ladder, raising your arm? Is it sitting and reaching and raising your arm? Is it sitting and driving, picking your coffee cup up? Is it when you are sitting and you have to just sit it for a long period of time, and then all of a sudden you move your arm? So I think that, or just sitting and looking down and you have arm pain, so it's really in the context of their overall story. And, we ask, I think in this particular podcast was released today, was one of my patients. I mean, her subjective took almost an hour. So it was asking probing questions about what was bothering him, but you want to be able to, you can pick out movement patterns and then adjust as needed. So, and I think that's the fun, that's the beauty of what we do, because everybody is so dynamic, and who wants to look at this all day? I mean, we can, but, ultimately it needs to be in the context of the person's, meaningful position. And there are times when I've had to literally get patients into positions that you would never think of, like lying, like I had a patient, for example, he said, when I'm sleeping, that's when I feel it. That's it. Sleeping. Got him in the sleeping position, put in whatever pillows he needed, I turned the lights off. I mean, mimic the environment as best as you can. And I think that's really the ultimate sort of answer in a way, mimic the environment with basic, functional movement patterns. Anything else? I don't see any questions, but
hi, Nicole. Thanks for watching.
I don't see it. Thanks. I don't see any of the people, but
so
we'll get this fixed one day.
the people who have written in are Annie and Lindsay and Nicole.
Hi, Annie.
So
hi, Nicole. Hi, Lindsay. Hi, Annie. Thank you for watching.
So
everybody.
See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.